Time has passed, and Augustine has been a Manichaean now for several years. One of the things that attracted Augustine to the Manichaean faith was the promise that they could provide rational proofs for everything that they believed. Think of what an enormously attractive selling point that is to an aspiring philosopher, someone who loves wisdom more than anything else. Is not the whole goal of philosophy to move from opinion to knowledge? And isn't knowledge the ability to truly know things and to have a rational proof, a verifiable demonstration for everything that you hold? So this is very appealing. The problem is they can't deliver on their promise. Every time Augustine asks them a hard question, they say, "Oh, well, that's a great question, but you know what? You really need to ask Faustus." Faustus is this very wise Manichaean bishop, and once he comes to town, you can ask him all these questions and he will provide totally satisfactory answers. So he waits, Augustine does, years and years, until finally Faustus comes to North Africa. Augustine is so excited, asks him a bunch of questions, and to his great disappointment, Faustus does not know what he's talking about. As a matter of fact, Augustine's hope was to basically become Faustus's disciple, but what happens is Faustus becomes his disciple. Augustine needs to teach him certain basic things about the liberal arts, and Augustine is a liberal arts teacher. So it's the exact opposite relationship as what he wanted. But he does learn a couple things from this encounter with Faustus. Number one, he realizes that it was unreasonable for him to want a religion that could provide rational proofs for everything that it believed, especially where faith is concerned, a religion of faith. For example, Augustine comes to realize it is quite reasonable for Christianity to say, we do not have verifiable proof for everything that we believe. That's why it's called belief. If it were more than that, it would be called knowledge, and then where's the virtue of faith in that? For example, it is reasonable to believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. There is some compelling evidence that suggests that he did. The testimony of the apostles, we believe, is reliable. And it is the job of the Christian to persuade others that this is a reasonable belief. But you cannot empirically prove or mathematically prove that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And that's actually a good thing, because if you could prove it, there would be no belief in the resurrection. It would be knowledge in the resurrection. And there is actually a certain virtue or merit to believing. Blessed are those who have not seen yet believed. There's something good about that. It takes a certain gift to make that leap of faith. So it is reasonable for a religion of faith to say we can't prove everything that we believe. On the other hand, Augustine also comes to learn from his encounter with Faustus that a religion can make claims that are, in a sense, are above reason, that reason can neither prove nor disprove. That's one thing. On the other hand, woe unto a religion that flatly contradicts reason. And that's where the Manichaeans fell short. The Manichaeans were super into astrology. They had these elaborate horoscopes. They believed the stars controlled our fates. And Augustine had studied astronomy. He had studied the actual science or liberal art of astronomy. And so there were certain things he knew to be true from his study of astronomy that these astrological teachings of the Manichaeans flatly contradicted. So in other words, Augustine was using his reason to disprove Manichaean belief. So remember I told you to think about faith and reason when you're reading the Confessions? So let's think about that now. What is Augustine learning about the relationship between faith and reason, or at least true faith and right reason? He realizes two things. Number one, faith can make claims that are above reason, that reason can neither prove nor disprove, but faith should not make claims that are against reason. When it does that, reason has the power to disprove it. So, or to put that from the opposite point of view, reason cannot know what the true religion is. For example, reason alone cannot know whether Jesus Christ rose from the dead. It can't prove that statement, it can't disprove that statement. It can't disprove that statement, incidentally. Modern science cannot prove that it is impossible for Jesus Christ to have risen from the dead. What modern science can prove is that it is highly unlikely for a human being to rise from the dead. And I absolutely agree with that statement. It is highly unlikely for a human being to rise from the dead, unless he also happens to be God. And that's an area that modern science cannot weigh in on either. It can only study empirical phenomena. So, coming back to the 2 points, religion can make claims that are above reason, but it cannot make claims that are against reason. Reason cannot prove or disprove that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. But, according to Augustine, reason could totally disprove the astrological doctrines of the Manichaeans. So reason cannot lead you to the true religion, but reason can weed out false religions that make rationally incoherent claims. And Augustine is coming to the opinion that Christianity does not make rationally incoherent claims. A belief in the resurrection is not unreasonable. And think of other Christian doctrines like the Trinity. The Trinity is definitely one of those doctrines that is above reason. Reason cannot prove or disprove that God is Trinitarian. Nor can it say that it is logically absurd. If the Christian teaching were that there were 3 persons in one person, that would be logically absurd and reason could disprove it. If the Christian teaching were that there were 3 gods in one God, same thing. But that's not the Christian teaching. The Christian teaching is that there are 3 persons in one God. And if you know what the church means by person, and you know what the church means by God, there's no contradiction. There's no incoherence. Reason can simply just shrug its shoulders, but it can't say, oh no, this is ridiculous. So for Augustine, there is no contradiction between true faith and right reason. And if you think there is, then one of 2 things has happened. You have misunderstood the teachings of the faith, or you have misunderstood the conclusions of reason. And there are many examples throughout history where both of those errors have been made. But there is no fundamental contradiction between true faith and right reason. So this was a very important meeting. Even though it disappointed him at the time, meeting Faustus begins his journey to end his relationship with the Manichaeans. As he himself puts it, Augustine, it was at that time that the noose around my neck got a little looser. Another important thing that happens to Augustine that he mentions in Book 5 is that he moves from Carthage to Rome. And he gives us the reason for this. Number 1, he says, I was tired of the students in Carthage. I heard that Roman students were better behaved. Apparently, Carthaginian students, there was kind of a frat called the Overturners. They sounded kind of like the Nose Brothers on steroids, that they would literally run into class while class was in session and start overturning chairs and tables and desks. This did not please Augustine. He was a little fed up with this. So there is the promise of a better student body in Rome. Clearly, the move from Carthage to Rome was another incentive. Carthage was, it was a good job, but it was still kind of the hinterlands, flyover country, if you will. Rome was the big leagues. And he doesn't mention this explicitly, but you can kind of guess that he may have also wished to escape his very clinging mother, Monica, who was very worried about his spiritual condition and tried to keep a close eye on him, was constantly praying and weeping. And he ditches her. He does not want her to come with him to Rome. He deceives her, says he's going to take a certain ship out and takes another one instead, and leaves her weeping on the shores of Carthage. Does that image sound familiar, incidentally? A woman weeping on the shores of Carthage as a man that she loves sails away to Italy? This is clearly inspired by the most famous scene of the Aeneid, Dido and Aeneas. Not that Augustine's making it up, but he is telling his own story in such a way that clearly is evocative of the Aeneid. I thought he didn't like the Aeneid. Well, yes, again. He is reusing the Aeneid in a particular way. He obviously doesn't think that badly of it, that not so badly that he couldn't use it in his own narrative. Let's keep an eye on that, and we'll try to come back to that at a later point. Anyway, he knows that he has particular reasons for going to Rome. But then he goes on to say, but the real reason, O God, that you wanted me to go to Rome was to eventually meet your servant Ambrose. So notice, there are two different things going on here. There's a first level of what we might call free will, which is a whole nexus, or a response, I should say, of your own personal preferences, circumstances, and so forth. Augustine, of his own free will, is responding to circumstances. He's responding to the Carthaginian students. He's responding to a job opening in Rome. He's responding to his own preferences. And no one's pulling his strings. No one's making him a puppet. This is him exercising free choice. But in addition to this nexus of freely made decisions is God's providence, calling Augustine back to him. And the question is, what's the relationship between these two things? Is there a conflict between them? Does providence negate free will? In other words, is the Christian idea of providence kind of like the Greek idea of fate, where you are foreordained to do this, whether you like it or not? You are a puppet on a string. The Greek notion of fate trumps and violates human free will, but not the Christian notion of providence. Notice how it operates. It doesn't operate outside of human free will, but quite the contrary, it takes advantage of Augustine's freely made decisions to bring about a providential end. God is eternal, and as eternal, he can see past, present, and future as present. He sees it all in a single moment, so he sees all the chess moves on the board. And so he can rearrange matters in such a way, circumstances, opportunities, and what have you, so that it brings about a providential end, all without violating our free will. On the contrary, he presupposes our free will in order to bring about a providential end. There is no contradiction between free will and providence, because providence works in and through free will, or at least through freely made decisions. And what's amazing about this is that this shows that God really is constantly loving us and calling us back to him. God does this in dramatic ways through supernatural events like miracles, But Augustine's point is he's also doing it through ordinary ways, like job openings that enable you to meet someone really special. And that's the key to recognizing the deeper level of meaning to your existence. The key is learning to recognize the extraordinary hand of God in the ordinary events of your life. I mean, think about that with even the bad things that happen to you. At the time, you have no idea why it's happening to you, but then maybe years later you look back on that and you say, oh, that's why that happened. God was trying to lead me to this particular good. How many times do you read in the Confessions Augustine saying, "For I did not know at the time, O Lord." Hindsight is 20/20, and so is understanding providence. Ask yourself, why the coronavirus? Why is this bad thing happening? Why is it happening to me? You may be suffering in one way or another. You may not know the answer of that now or next year or even 10 years from now. But maybe one day you look back and like, oh, what extraordinary goods came out of this time of suffering or inconvenience. I see that God was somehow reaching out to me, loving me, even in the midst of this misfortune. That's reading on that deeper level of reality. And that is understanding better the enigma of your existence. So he's providentially called to Rome in order to eventually go to Milan, where he meets the Bishop of Milan, St. Ambrose. And he meets Ambrose because he has heard that he is a good preacher. And Augustine is a teacher of rhetoric, a professor. And so he's heard, oh yeah, there's a pretty good rhetorician, so I should go hear him. So in other words, he comes to Ambrose for the style, but stays for the substance. Remember that motif of style versus substance in Book 3 with Cicero and the Bible and the Manichaeans? He comes for the style, but he stays for the substance. Interestingly enough, he contrasts Ambrose with Faustus. Faustus actually had kind of a better style. Faustus was actually a better speaker than Ambrose, Augustine admits, but when it comes to the substance, there was no comparison. For the big thing that Ambrose kept preaching again and again and again in his sermons was that the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. That famous line from St. Paul. But Ambrose, and I think he does this rightly, incidentally, interprets that in terms of interpretations of the sacred text. His point was this, that when you interpret some passages of the Old Testament literally, it kills your understanding of God. And it's only when you understand them spiritually that it opens up the real meaning. Specifically, there are lots of quote-unquote carnal descriptions of God in the Old Testament. God having legs that walk in the cool of the afternoon in the Garden of Eden. God having an arm that smites people. God being emotional and getting angry and changing his mind, repenting that he had made mankind during the time of the flood. All of these things are carnal descriptions of God. They portray him as basically a human being. And the Manichaeans had glommed on to the Old Testament and said, aha, look at what primitive ideas about God the Christians have. Look at how stupid and carnal-minded they are. We Manichaeans are sophisticated. We understand that God is spirit. He's not a body. We don't think God has it. We know God doesn't have an arm or legs. Remember, we're talking about pre-incarnate God. We're not talking about Jesus Christ. That's a different conversation. But God as God, God as spirit, no, he doesn't have body parts. These stupid Christians, they're so crude and naive. And Augustine believed the Manichaean critique of Christianity all this time. And now here he is sitting in the pews of a basilica, and he's hearing straight from the horse's mouth, straight from a Catholic bishop, that this is not what Christians believe. Augustine says, "For years like a fool, I barked away against the Catholic faith, never stopping to ask whether the Manichaean portrayal of them was accurate." Think of that today when we have certain impressions about a different religion. We think Catholics believe this, or Christians believe this, or Muslims believe this. Are we accurate? And maybe we should actually ask a believer of that, within that group, what they actually believe in. Try to find a competent authority when you ask those questions. But Ambrose was a competent authority. He was a Catholic bishop. So Augustine is blown away to realize that all these accusations that the Manichaeans had made against the Christians were false. That yes, Christians believe in the 100% truth of the Old Testament, but that doesn't mean they believe that all these truths are expressed literally. Ambrose says, when you come upon a carnal description of God, you do not interpret it literally. What you look for is a spiritual meaning. And so the arm of God doesn't mean that he has a physical limb. It means that he has strength. He has some kind of spiritual quality. Notice, incidentally, how this important teaching of these two different levels of Scripture, in some respects, tie into these two different levels of reality. You can almost think of, level one as the literal meaning of the text. And then the deeper meaning is the spiritual meaning. And the literal meaning has its own validity, has its own realm of accuracy. But to fully understand what's going on, you have to delve down to the deeper hidden meaning, the spiritual meaning, unlock that spiritual meaning, that spiritual reality that is being signified by the literal. So it was indeed providential that Augustine met Ambrose and learned about the importance of approaching reality not as if it's some kind of monolithic thing, but recognizing that it has levels of meaning. You have to read reality in a sort of bifocal or polyphonic manner. And one of the reasons why the Bible is so important is that it helps you learn to read reality in this polyphonic, bifocal manner, because the Bible itself is written in such a way. Book 6 of the Confessions has a lot in it. There is, for example, a fascinating discussion of Alypius, his good friend, Augustine's good friend, and a description of the power of the gladiator games, the attraction of blood sport, the power again of getting sucked into a cycle of friendship unfriendly, where you relapse in your bad habits, in your addictions. But speaking of addictions, we're going to stick to Augustine for Book 6, and we're just going to hit some of the highlights, because he's made so much progress. He's become disillusioned with the Manichaeans in Book 5. He's more open to Christianity. In Book 6, we also learn that he is disillusioned with the Roman ladder of success. Augustine really aspired to be sort of a Roman yuppie, a young urban professional who is going to climb the ladder of success and become very powerful. In Book 6, he's gotten tired of it. He realizes that these worldly ambitions are empty. There's this very poignant scene where he and his buddies are walking along, his fellow yuppies, and they see this beggar in the street who's drunk, but giggling to himself in his intoxication. And Augustine says, "You see that guy? He is actually happier than we are now. Yes, I know that that's a fake happiness and that his buzz is going to wear off and he's going to be hungover in the morning. But at least he can claim something. And look at us, these rich, powerful men of the empire, and we're utterly miserable. He's becoming disillusioned with the false promises of the world, which is an improvement. It's a step in the right direction. And then finally, he realizes, thanks to Ambrose, that Christianity is reasonable. It's reasonable in not making promises it can't keep. It is reasonable in its reading of the scriptures. There's something attractive about this faith. So, why does he not convert? Well, he is still held back by a number of problems, and we can divide them into intellectual and moral. Augustine has two huge intellectual hang-ups or snags. Number one, he keeps thinking of God as some kind of a body. Just like the Manichaeans, he knows that God is spirit and not body, but just like the Manichaeans, he can't stop thinking of God in terms of some bodily substance. So, for example, he thinks, okay, I'm going to just think of God as pure spirit. So how do I understand God's presence to the universe? Remember that question of presence in the opening chapters of Book 1, the overture to the book? How do I understand God's presence to his creation? Well, maybe the universe is like a sponge, and God is different from the sponge, so he's the water, and the water fills every nook and cranny of the sponge and is present to it without it being the sponge. Well, that does differentiate God from his creation, but notice if that metaphor is true, it means that there is more of God in an elephant than there is in a sparrow. There's more of God in a fat man than in a thin man. When you come to college and you put on your freshman 15, do you say, got more God? Doesn't quite work that way, right? You're thinking of God in a material, spatial way when you think of him as water filling a sponge. And so Augustine keeps racking his brains trying to figure out, okay, I need to come up with another metaphor or something, but he can't. He's at a dead end. So he keeps thinking of God as a body. And similarly, he keeps thinking of evil as a substance. He's again hooked into that Manichaean dualism, where good is one thing, evil is another thing, and these two things fight each other. And he somehow knows this is incoherent. When you really research into the matter of Manichaean dualism, it just doesn't add up. Like, where does the bad God come from, for example? And as one of Augustine's friends, Nebridius, asks, what if the good God just suddenly said, I'm tired of fighting? What would happen to the universe? What would happen to our whole understanding of reality? Would the bad God automatically win? Well, then there goes your dualism. And if the bad God doesn't win, then what else is going on? Why is the good God even fighting? It's just an incoherent thing. So, evil is not a substance. It's not a separate thing fighting against the good thing. But then what is it? He just can't figure it out. So he's got some intellectual snags, which he knows he has to work through in order to fully assent to Christian teaching. But in addition, he's got a huge moral snag. And that moral snag has to do with the way he is living his life. Augustine, as you know, from a very early age, took a mistress and fathered an illegitimate child. And he knows that's wrong, and he knows he's got to get rid of the mistress. His mother tries to harness his energy, so to speak, in the right direction. She arranges a marriage for her son, which was quite common at the time. It was also quite common at the time that much older men would marry much younger women. And so he has to wait 2 years, even though he's in his early 30s, he has to wait 2 years for his fiancée to be old enough to be married. Remember that infant mortality rates were very high, and a lot of women died in childbirth. So it kind of made sense to have the older man with the younger woman. But anyway, he's got to wait 2 years. So he's engaged now, so he's got to put away mistress number one, which he describes as a devastating experience. Their two hearts were interwoven, he said, and when hers got ripped from his heart bled. But then he's got to wait now as a chaste fiancé for 2 years, and he can't do it. He can't do it. And he takes another mistress. He's got a problem. He has become addicted to the pleasures of the flesh, and even though he knows it's wrong, he can't let go of those habits. So he's in a bind. He's intellectually in a bind, and he is morally in a bind. And we have to turn to the later books of the Confessions to see how he gets out of it.